Did anyone else become a participant in the social experiment known as Flat Stanley? I went to elementary school in the mid-90s, 95 to 2001, and I was in the 3rd grade when our teacher announced that we would be taking part in the Flat Stanley project. For those of you unfamiliar with the concept, Flat Stanley was a series of books about a flat kid who goes on all kinds of weird adventures to famous places. New York, the Grand Canyon, France, Australia. This guy went everywhere and was like a flat version of Curious George. We started reading them in class, making them part of our English hour, and one day, Mrs. Gazel told us that we were going to have a contest. Today's English lesson is to create your own Flat Stanley. It can look however you want, but the winner of the contest will get 3 prizes from the prize basket, and will be the class's Flat Stanley that we send into the world to participate in the Flat Stanley project. We were all excited. This was a chance to see our work in pictures that would come back, not to mention get some cool stuff out of the prize basket. We all drew out our own concepts for Flat Stanley and set to work coloring and designing him. My Flat Stanley was a spy, wearing a big trench coat and a wide hat and carrying binoculars. He wore his regular clothes under it, and he just looked so goofy that I thought I had a real chance of winning. My friend Todd laughed when he glanced over at it, telling me it was cool. His Flat Stanley was a football player for the Georgia Bulldogs, his favorite team, and I thought his Flat Stanley looked cool too. So when the class voted on the displayed Stanleys, I figured Kaylee's Flat Stanley would win. It had a sparkly tiara and a ball gown she had made with felt. That was the one that I voted for, at least, since you couldn't vote for your own. And if not hers, I figured Matt's would win. His Flat Stanley was a truck driver, complete with a net hat and a sleeveless t-shirt, and he'd put a lot of work into it. I knew some kids might find mine funny, but I never figured I stood a chance. I hadn't used any special materials or done anything really innovative, and I figured I'd hang him in my room when I got home. So when Miss Gazel announced that my Flat Stanley had won, I was shocked. I went home that night with a new bounce ball, a pocket-sized Stretch Armstrong, and an eraser shaped like a Pikachu. I also went home to tell my mom that I had won the contest and that my Flat Stanley would be going out to other schools and other places, so we could get pictures back and see all the cool places that he had been. She said that sounded really neat, and we brainstormed where he might end up. Paris, Disneyland, the moon. We both laughed at that one, and maybe even at an Atlanta Braves baseball game. We had a good afternoon thinking about where he might end up, and when Dad got home, he joined us in our daydream. I went to bed that night, thinking about all the cool places Stanley might go, and what we might see when he came back. It started out pretty normal. Mrs. Gazel sent the package out to a school the next town over, and they sent us back pictures a week later. Stanley had been to a volleyball game, an art museum, and finally to a play put on by the class. They sent him up the road to the next school, where Stanley went on a hike, went to the zoo, and then went to a baseball game. It wasn't the Atlanta Braves, but it was a t-ball game, and that was still pretty neat. This went on for a couple of months, Flat Stanley traveling to Texas, New Mexico, California, Idaho, and Kansas. We hung the pictures up, sent out thank you cards, and talked about the places that Flat Stanley had gone. It was a good time, and we used it for our geography class to help us learn the states. It seemed that Flat Stanley was in all our lessons that year. Math, if Flat Stanley travels from Burbank, California to El Paso, Texas, how far has he traveled? Geography, if Flat Stanley is at the Alamo, then where is he? And of course, English, where we read the books and the letters that we got back out loud. It was approaching April when we came to class to find that Miss Gazel wasn't there. We were all pretty bummed because Wednesdays were usually when we got our Flat Stanley letters, and the sub told us that Miss Gazel would talk to us about it when she got back. There was no Flat Stanley that day, and when Miss Gazel came back the following week, we moved on to something else. All the Flat Stanley stuff had disappeared from the class, and its absence was as noticeable as our missing teacher had been. She never told us what had happened, and it was a mystery talked about in hushed tones well into the 4th grade. It would probably still be a mystery if I hadn't decided a decade later to pursue teaching. I'm in my 2nd year of college now, and I've progressed into student teaching. I decided that I wanted to try my hand at being an elementary school teacher, something like 4th or 5th grade. And when they gave me the name of my mentor, I realized I knew her. It was Miss Gazel, my old 3rd grade teacher. She taught 5th grade now, her retirement coming up on the horizon, and she smiled when she realized who I was, giving me a big hug. "Welcome back. I'm glad to see you decided to take up teaching." Her classroom was in the same room her 3rd grade class had been in, and the kids reminded me a lot of me and my friends when we were her students. They were a good group. They were hungry to learn, and they liked her a lot. Miss Gazel was the kind of teacher that kept kids' attention effortlessly, and I hoped it was a skill that I could learn from her. The kiddos in her class took to me pretty quickly, and soon I was teaching classes while Miss Gazel just sat back and observed. Something about being in her class again made me remember my days as a 3rd grader at this school, and that made me think about Flat Stanley. There was nothing like that in her 5th grade class. The kids would have probably thought it was babyish, but it did rekindle some of the mystery I had felt from a decade before. I tried to find a good time to bring it up, but nothing seemed to present itself. Until Friday, on my 2nd week. I was packing up to leave when Miss Gazel offered to take me out for some drinks. I was a little surprised, and she must have noticed because she laughed airily at my look of chagrin. "What, you didn't know teachers drank?" she said, her coat over one arm. I decided to join her and found a small group of other teachers waiting for us when we arrived. Some of them I knew, some of them I didn't, but it turned out that this was a regular thing for them. They drank and talked about their week, complained about some students who were especially difficult, and generally blew off steam. Mrs. Gazel and I sat in the corner, nodding and listening to them, and she smiled at me over the lip of her 4th glass of wine sometime near 11. "I've been sending glowing reviews to your professor," she confided. "You're one of the better student teachers I've ever worked with. I think you're probably a shoo-in to be hired at the end of your training period, and I'll recommend you to the principal myself if he doesn't extend you a position." I thanked her, sipping my 2nd beer as I took it all in. "Hey, can I ask you something?" I said suddenly. "Neither of us are drunk enough for you to offer me a ride home yet, big fella," she said, snorting into her glass. No, nothing like that. Something always bugged me from my time in your class, and I was wondering if you remember the Flat Stanley project we did." Some of the color fled from her cheeks, and I could swear that she shuddered a little. "I'm surprised you even remember that. It was a long time ago." "Well, everything disappeared from the class so quickly, and when you came back, you never brought it up again. All the books were gone from the class library. All the letters were gone. Everything was missing. I think we talked about it for half of the 4th grade before something else caught our attention." She looked far away for a moment, as if contemplating whether she actually wanted to answer me or not. "I think I need a little air. Would you care to escort me?" I told her I would, and we left amidst a hail of catcalls about cradle robbers and cougars on the prowl. I had taken her arm, and she was trying to be unbothered by it, but she was stiff and a little unsteady as we walked out onto the patio. Something had her spooked, and I didn't think it was the half-hearted teasing from her peers. When we came outside, she leaned against the railing outside the seating area, looking at the waves as they crashed against the water below us. I came to lean beside her, realizing she was trying to figure out how to begin, and having trouble getting started. "Are you sure you want to know? That's a pretty messed up story, but I suppose we could count it as a part of your education. Maybe it'll help you avoid something that got me in a lot of hot water and canceled the Flat Stanley project for the whole school." I told her I did, pretty intrigued with what could have happened to make a whole school ban something as benign as a kid's art project. "Well, you remember that we sent the little guy around to the school the next town over? Well, then they sent it to another school, and that school sent it to another school, and so on and so forth. We had about the best results out of any of the classes, getting back about twice as much material as is normal. I started integrating it into the curriculum, as you remember, and it was such a huge part of our class. I appreciated the material. Sometimes it's hard to keep kids' attention when they're that young, but Stanley really helped. Then one day, I arrived to find a new package had come the day before. She stopped, shivering a little as she watched the waves. Someone had sent our Flat Stanley back, and I was excited as I opened the envelope. We were starting fractions that day. At least we were supposed to, and I wanted to see if there was some way I could work fractions into the package. I would get my wish, but not in the way I wanted. I had reached into my pocket for a cigarette, and Miss Gazel asked if she could have one. I had never seen her smoke before, but as she inhaled that first mouthful, she closed her eyes and looked euphoric. Flat Stanley was supposed to go to Carter Wild Elementary School in Boise, but it appeared he had gone somewhere else. You're too young to remember it, but there was a pretty terrible person in the Midwest in the late 90s. He was picking up young women who were hitchhiking. The police would find them later after he was done with them. Somehow, he got our Flat Stanley and thought it would be funny to use him to taunt the police. He had murdered 5 girls that week. Her voice broke as she said it, the tip of the cigarette jittering as she spoke, and attached pictures of them to the Stanley he sent back. They were horrific, and as I spilled them out of my desk, I recognized what I had at once. She was shaking, and as I put my jacket around her, she smiled ruefully at me. "You're a good kid, despite making me relive this. We knew that the kids in my class had all kinds of weird ideas about what had happened, but we also knew that none of you knew the truth." She took a long pull off the cigarette and let the ash dribble down. "The first girl in the pictures was Ashley Manx. He had cut her chest open, the X going right between her breasts, and skinned her open like some kind of flower. Her face was set in the worst possible look you've ever seen, and right there in the middle of her chest was Flat Stanley. Your Flat Stanley. I thought I got it then, but Miss Gazel hadn't even gotten rolling yet. Then there was Frances Carmichael, the girl he took from the fair. She was looking for a ride, and he gave her one. He cut her arms and legs off while she was alive, burning the wounds closed with an iron so she'd bleed out slowly. Finally, he cut her throat, and after that, he put 1 foot from that Flat Stanley in her teeth and took a picture. He was standing upright, her body on display, and her burnt nubs are something I still can't quite get out of my head. I'm sorry, I started, but she cut me off. No, you wanted to know, so let me get it out. It's like the confessional I used to go to when I was little. If I get it all out, maybe it won't haunt me as bad. He got Dawn Cambridge and Betsy Cambridge next, split their backs, and made a pair of blood angels out of them. He set Flat Stanley in the middle of them, the crevice between their sides, and snapped a picture. They were still looking for them when they found Ashley. Finally, he got Melanie Fasterly, and she was probably the worst. He beat her with a sledgehammer until her bones were like glass shards. The picture he sent back was unrecognizable as a human being. If it hadn't been for the hair, I would never have known what it was. He stood the cutout between her lumpy legs as if to save her modesty, and she honestly looked about as flat as he was, if you don't count all the bone spurs sticking out of her. Mrs. Gazel was shaking, the shivering causing her to stutter over the last few words, and when she looked back at me, there was regret on her face. All the alcohol had been burned out of her, the fear having shaken it loose as her mind remembered what was likely the worst day of her life. I called the police, of course I did, but my real concern was for you guys. If this psycho had mailed this back to us, then he had the address of the school. If he knew where you were, then he could pay us a visit and make us his next photo collage, and I couldn't have lived with myself if that had happened. So I gave the police everything, and they agreed to keep an eye on the school for a while. I needn't have bothered. The twisted fuck had a particular hunting ground and a particular prey, neither of which were children in Georgia. He never did pay us a visit, but it took 6 more girls before they caught him. I didn't sleep well until they had him in custody, and I didn't sleep soundly until they slipped the needle into his arm last year. He was a rotten, twisted individual, and he deserved every ounce of what he got. I had to take the rest of the week off to recover from his little present, and there was talk that they might want me to undergo counseling. When I got back, the school had scrapped all that Flat Stanley stuff. It was too much of a risk that some student would get a hold of it next. And they couldn't have that. Some of the teachers thought we should tell the students. Some of them thought we should tell the parents, and a few of them thought that I should be fired for some reason. It was decided that we wouldn't tell any of them, and we would never speak of it again. In exchange for not causing an uproar, I got to keep my job. I thought it was a pretty fitting trade back then. So that's the whole sad story. Cure your curiosity? It did. Mrs. Gazel was right, too. They offered me a job at the end of my training, and it turned out it was her job. Mrs. Gazel retired at the end of the year, wanting to spend more time with her grandkids and her daughters. We still get drinks sometimes, and she really is a lovely woman. As for me, I noticed one major part of the contract that I was presented with. They put it in bold so you couldn't possibly miss it, so if you break it, you really only have yourself to blame. Under no circumstances will our students participate in any program that sends documents to other schools or entities without the express permission of administration. This includes pen pal programs, Hands Across the Water, the Flat Stanley Project, and other affiliated projects therewithin. I signed that contract 10 years ago, and now I instruct student teachers myself. In the decade I've been teaching, I've never broken that rule, and I have Mrs. Gazel's story to thank for that. When you send something like that out into the world, you never know who might answer back, and what they might have to say. You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad and Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Janet, Lee Kendall, Saikat, Ronda J, Sue Casper, and Valinator for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. And thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, Sarah ASMR42, Grim Reaper, and TomBoiTopUwU for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. And a special thanks to Grim Reaper, who appears to have subscribed not just on YouTube, but also on my Patreon. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you, and your support is always appreciated. If you'd like to support the channel, then come on down to Patreon, or become a member on YouTube. Spooky Skeleton tier contributors, that's our $5 tier, get their spooky 12 hours early, at 8:30 a.m., as opposed to 8:30 p.m., my time, of course. And while Ghostly Reading is only a tier that's available on Patreon, you get a signed copy of my book anytime I write one, on your doorstep in, hopefully, a timely manner. If you'd like a book, we have many on Amazon. I've got links below if you'd like to follow those. Should get you to my page so you can buy any one of my 8 books, I believe we're up to now. I'm sure they'd look really nice on your shelf, and I'll sign them for you if you can find me out in the wild. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.